Okay, this is the GMing Masterclass panel for Gauntlet Con. My name is Jason Cordova. I'm going to be the moderator of this panel. For folks watching who don't know who I am one of the organizers of the Gauntlet community, and I co-host several of our podcasts, including the Gauntlet podcast, the Discern Realities podcast, which is a Dungeon World podcast, and Fear of a Black Dragon, our brand new OSR podcast. I am joined today on the panel by Phil Vecchione and Ryan Macklin. Phil Vecchione is the co-host of the Misdirected Mark and Pandas Talking Games podcasts. He's a founding member of Gnome Stew, and he's one of the partners at Encoded Designs. Phil, thanks for being on the panel.
Oh, thanks for having me. That's awesome.
And Ryan, I'm sure you all know who Ryan Macklin is, but in case you don't, he has worked on a variety of tabletop games over the last decade, and he has posted frequently on his years-long blog. And also, a little thing, Ryan, when I was first getting back into role-playing games, like around 2012.
I'm going to get another gray hair about this, aren't I? Fantastic.
Well, 2012, 2013, 5 years ago, not too bad.
All right.
When I was first getting back into RPGs, one of the very first indie games that I played, I think the very first one I played was Shovel Harry Roach, but the second one was like Mythender. And so,
fantastic. Awesome.
Yeah, so and my love of indie RPGs has not stopped, and so basically the Gauntlet is your fault. So you could just like,
I have a lot of things in this community that are my fault, and I take absolutely no responsibility over any of them.
Well, thanks for being on the panel.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so here's how this discussion is going to go. We've divided up into 4 parts, basically. We're going to start with, it's the GMing Masterclass, which no pressure, right? But we've divided the discussion up into 4 parts. The first is going to be, we're going to talk about like things we do before the game session. So planning and prep and just any like little sort of activity you might engage in before you actually get at the table. The second part is going to be like, okay, now we're at the table, and what sorts of expectation setting type things do we do for the players? The third part will be in the middle of the game, in particular sharing spotlight, which I think is a really important and useful skill as a GM. And then we're going to wrap up with the fourth part, which will be sort of like after session procedures and rituals and kind of what we're trying to aim for when we do those things. During all of it, I will do my best to pay attention to the Discord channel. So anybody who's watching, if you have any questions, drop them in there. I'm not going to make any promises that I'm going to catch them or pose them to the panelists, but I will do my best. So with that in mind, let's just get started. So let's talk about before the game session, let's talk about prep. So Phil, just sort of big picture, what do you do for prep? Like, what do you do when you're getting ready for a session?
So it's going to depend a lot on what game I'm playing, because what game I'm playing is going to kind of determine what the general activities are for, for that game. So, really, really quickly, like if I'm going to be, for me running something that's powered by the apocalypse, then I want to have like a rough idea, but not really too strong of an idea of like what kind of things may happen. I might think of like what fronts do I want to push on for a given evening, which kind of things would be fun to introduce into the game as, when I get a hard move and something like that. If I'm doing something like Blades in the Dark, Blades has, a pretty set procedure. So I want to know like, okay, well for this session, I think we're going to be able to do free play and maybe get into the score for this, and then I'll plan around that. And then if it's something like, Dungeon Crawl Classics, well then, I probably have either prepped an adventure or I'm running something published, and then I want to just be prepared with, where I think we're going to go, in the dungeon that evening.
Yeah, game dependent. That makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
Ryan, what about you? Do you prep?
I do my best to not.
Okay.
Or rather, the games I design are ones that allow me to be lazy. That's sort of the joke there, but really I've spent 10 years, more than 10 years being a convention GM. So what I have in my head are a lot of patterns. Mm-hmm. So at this point, what I want to do is just take one of those patterns, learn the game system enough to be able to be just like essentially flexibly figure like out what to do in any given beat. And execute it, which means that my prep is by and large a combination of system mastery and making like post-it notes or 3x5 cards of, okay, this is kind of the structure that this is probably going to go. And like I mean, when I run like Fate and stuff like that for people, because at this point I don't necessarily run it for like a home group or anything, but I do it at cons. It's absolutely that. I go in, I know I people love it because I will have absolutely no idea what we're doing, and be like, okay, tell me what setting we're doing. Fantastic, that sounds great. Let me figure it out, and that's all because of the prep work of 10 years of patterns rather than the prep work of 3 hours of paperwork.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up because I get asked pretty frequently. Like people will say, like, "Oh, you're a really good like improv GM. Like if my players zig, I can always zag, right? Or I can always do the thing that to respond." And it's like, well, how do you do that? How do you become like such a good like improv GM? How do you know to react to things like that like so quickly? And it kind of goes to what you were saying there, right? Which is like, it's not a great answer, but to some degree, it's that archive, right? Like it's that like experience of having done it for a while, and you just have like things you can grab onto, and you have like you've got lanes that you can like steer the car into if you need to, right? Like when things are going on. I think what's a really interesting angle, and maybe we can talk about it here in a bit, is like, how do you short circuit that process, right? Like if you have not been doing it for years, if you maybe don't have like all the like pop culture or cultural references, that you want, what are some things you can do to sort of like circumvent that, get to a good place? So we might get to that at the outset. If you guys have any thoughts about that, jump in. But that's kind of my initial thinking there of like, what can we do to like, what are some things we can do to sort of like cut to the chase and kind of get people up to speed quickly,
For me, that's like studying film, studying other people's games. Like mindfulness is a big deal. Just pay attention after the fact, really. Like, what was the structure that went on? What worked? What didn't? Just being super mindful of the media you consume and participate in. That's like, that'll get you going in day one, really.
Yeah. So I want to get back to that in a second. Before we do, though, I think it'd be kind of helpful to like define or at least differentiate between preparation and planning, because I think they're two different things, right? Like, Phil, how do you like define those things, and what are the differences, if any? Maybe you don't.
No, I definitely have a difference between them, because I consider prep more like what Ryan was talking about, is having patterns, as well as kind of having any tools that are going to cover up any places where I'm going to naturally slow down. Like I'm terrible at coming up with names. So part of my prep is that I always have, the book of names with me at the table, or like a naming app or something, just something so that when we hit a name, I don't freeze up and slow everybody down. It could be, I would say prep is like just assembling your tools. Like if I have all these things in front of me, I can execute the game any way that any direction it goes. And then planning is really more if we're going to try to do a specific thing. So like, for instance, I've run Night's Black Agents a bunch of times. And for that, I will be like way more deliberate in my, as I'm preparing the game. I will be way more deliberate with an actual plan of like, here are the crime scenes, here are the clues, and kind of where I think they're going to trail off to, and still be flexible enough to bend that as we go. But having like a plan of like, this is how this, crime plays into the conspiracy, or this crime scene plays into the conspiracy, gives me at least a starting point to deviate from once the game gets going.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I like to do what I call like critically thinking about my setting. I'm never, the game prep I do. I'm unless it's a very like sort of like you said, like Night's Black Agents. I've never played that, but like if I like Monster of the Week, like where you have to plan like a really specific mystery with like certain things that have to happen. Setting that aside, like stuff where it's like a mystery or whatever. I like to just like, for me, it's just about thinking critically about the world, right? I have this little procedure that I've like shared with people before, which I call it 731, which is like you come up with 7 NPCs or scenarios or situations. You give each of them like 3 descriptive details, and then you give each of them one way you can personify it or present it at the table, right? Like either through your voice or your mannerisms. And I do that little procedure not because I want to have like a list of things in front of me for the game, but more because I want to think about the possibilities, right? Like it's it's a procedure, an exercise I engage in so I can think about the world, right? Because I feel like for me, that's what prep is. It's being able to respond to what the players do, right? Like knowing your world so well. Ryan, what do you think? Prep versus planning?
They blend for me. It's like if I'm doing something, if I'm playing, or sorry, if I'm running a game that has a particular structure to it, and that game gives me the ability to work within its structure as opposed to IDK play, right?
Right.
Then I will totally participate in its planning process. That tells me a lot about how the game's supposed to work, what the game intends. And that's both prep and planning, I guess, because there's that degree of understanding the game, system mastery on that level, not of mechanics, but of sort of intent, evocation, stuff like that. And it's planning in that you are coming up with potential executions of the structures that it's telling you to do and that you may or may not be familiar with, right? It's like both of those things. Like if I'm talking like pure prep work, it's like I'm running Apocalypse World. Let me print out a bunch of stuff, including the like my principles and agendas just to remember, so I can look on a thing like, all right, this is a good idea right now. I'm glad it's on one sheet. Like that's prep.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's a definition of prep. Yeah, I guess.
And that's like for me, like it is, assembling your tools.
Right.
But like that degree of constructing before the game possible stuff is just a planning that I don't find as interesting anymore.
That's super interesting.
I could not run a Knights Black Agents game. I could super play in one. I could totally play in one. But like seriously, you get me like half an hour into planning and I'm bored because I'm planning by myself.
It is more planning it was more planning than I thought, but actually in play, it was more improvisational than I thought it would be. Like there was enough, like you have to have enough logic. Like I guess it's like what Jason was saying. I need to like for each scene, I needed to have it kind of worked out in my head to understand what it looked like.
Right.
But then I could be totally flexible from there about, which, tools or skills they wanted to use to collect it. But yeah, it is. I think mysteries in general, emergent mysteries are fun to play when people do them, but they're not as tight as planned mysteries.
Yeah, they're real loosey-goosey, right? Yeah.
You're
better for like noir when you're not super interested in the forensic aspects, right?
Right. Well, what you're talking about is basically like assembling a lot of your Legos so that you've got these things that you can like mix and match, maybe not use, maybe use next time. Back when I did this, I would take a tendency to then try to assemble them too far.
Oh, I totally do.
And so like my boredom comes from that tendency. So I went to the exact opposite way and just be like, I just came up with a title for this con game. I don't know what we're doing. I really don't. And people love it.
Well, that's great. Well, let me kind of twist around the question a little bit because it sounds like what you're saying, Ryan, is like you've kind of moved beyond. We've gotten bored with like this idea of planning the world or.
Well, I wouldn't say move beyond. That sounds presumptuous. I mean, it's a failing of me that I get bored with this thing. It's not like I'm sorry, I've transcended y'all.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, what about this though? I plan not just I don't always sometimes prep or plan for setting, but I often plan for theme, right? Like I find myself preparing like I sometimes find myself like really interested in a theme or interested in like some kind of particular visual motif, or like I watched a movie that really inspired me, right? And so I want to like get that feeling. Do you guys do that kind of thing, Phil? Do you do that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean there'll be some, there'll be games where I want to hit on a certain beat, like for my Blades game has the one that I'm currently running has a lot of themes around family. And so, I will like purposely for a given session be like, all right, well, I really want to kind of drum up the family connection. So all the free play stuff I'm going to plan, I'm going to, pull in relatives, like no strangers, no, third, I'll just, populate it with that. So yeah, I think I do. And I'm kind of like Ryan. I did like a lot of heavy prep and planning for a long time. I mean, I like literally wrote the book on prep, and then like
right, yeah.
and then like over time, like I got to, and I wrote this, I wrote articles about this, about how I got tired of being so able to predict what was going on, that it was more fun for me if I kind of let go of a lot of stuff. So yeah, I've so I will do the same thing. I will plan lightly now, and then I just want like things to surprise me.
Yeah. Cool.
Do you mind if I, because I realize part of the problem of listening to me say structure is that I'm actually giving absolutely no helpful advice.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with like saying.
So like, I could give you an example structure.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, 4 players. 2 of them, immediate, very small fight. Other 2, ideally cross from the table, so that when they're talking to each other, and the people on either side don't have an immediate person being silent right next to them. So that there, and then this way, they are doing some sort of drama moment that ties in. Then these 2 have a reason to have to engage with each other in a new scene. So now we are discussing it like a new set. So now we're discussing a 3rd set in connection here. These 2 may not necessarily have anything right there. We go to big scene with everyone. Probably some sort of either emotional or physical conflict requires people to break off. These people now do a thing. Now I figure out from there where we go.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Like that is, and then it's like, and then from there it's like, I roughly have like, I know that these numbers represent X scale of opposition, these numbers represent Y scale of opposition, and I will assign them to the particular forms of opposition as needed. That's the sort of stuff that's just in my head as far as knowing how to structure something.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I definitely can't say that's how I like everybody thinks about their game in a different way, I guess, right? For me, I'm always like thinking about like theme more than I am about like any particular scene or like the setting or even the story, right? I like to, I'll sometimes like, for example, recently I was like, I want to have this adventure is going to be about, it's going to be about a village. It's going to be about a village of really paranoid people. There's been some conflict, and they all kind of are at each other's throats. And the party, it was a fantasy game, is walking into the middle of this, right? And they are going to have to navigate that. What I'll often do is like what I did in that case was I looked up films that were supposed to like have those kind of themes, right? And so in this case, it was The White Ribbon, Das Weiße Band in German. And it's got nothing. It's not fantasy at all. It's got nothing to do with like fantasy tropes or anything. It's about pre-World War II Germany, but actually pre-World War I Germany. And but it deals with those themes, right? It's got like villagers that like they're paranoid, they're like angry at each other. It's about little trifling things, and they're just at each other's throats. And I found it super helpful as a way of like grounding my NPCs and how to like think about situations and interactions. So that's just kind of how I do it. We should probably move on from prep. I'm going to check the Discord really quickly to see if we have anything interesting going on in there. Phil's keeping up with the Discord, so that's awesome.
my regular podcast has a chat room. I'm kind of used to.
Yeah, you're good at that. Yeah. See, we record our podcasts and then edit them. So
you also keep 2 thing called time.
fair.
Close to mine.
Let's talk about like setting expectations, and maybe we don't spend too much time here on this because I really want to get to spotlight management in the time that we have. But in terms of setting expectations, I think it's really important. I think it's important to set expectations for sort of like at the table things like table behavior and like safety tools and things like that. And then I also think it's important to set expectations vis-a-vis like the game itself, like the fiction and like how things might kind of proceed at the table. Phil, what's your thinking on like setting expectations for players? Is it important, and what kinds of things do you do?
Yeah, I actually think, setting expectations at almost every level, right? At the campaign level, even at the session level, I think is really important, because it's usually we have problems, at the table when we have mismatched expectations. So certainly at like a campaign level, I'm very clear, like this is what, as a group, let's talk about what we want this campaign to be and its overall direction. And we can change it afterwards, but we need a starting point. And then even with a session, I will often just casually come to the table and say like, hey, tonight's session, I think it's going to be some, like say it's Blades. I think it's going to be free play, I'd like to get into a score tonight. And, if we're lucky, maybe we'll finish that score out before the end of the night. And just kind of lay that down. Like, this is kind of where I think things are going, so that people can tell me immediately, like, oh, I thought we were going to do like something else tonight.
I agree with that 100%. I do a procedure I call called CAPS. That's what we do in the Gauntlet. A lot of us do anyway. And it stands for concept, aim, tone, and subject matter. And concept is concept of the game. Tone and subject matter are, obvious. Aim is the really interesting one. It kind of piggybacks off what you just said, Phil, which is I always use that opportunity to say, this is where I think the session is going. We're going to make characters. We're going to talk a little bit about like the world. We're going to do some establishing questions, and then we're going to play until we get to a certain point. And we'll get to this X point, like and try to find a good finishing spot, and then we'll pick up next week, right? I always like try to lay it out like that, so that just because I think players like are more into it, or at least are able to pay attention more. They don't get antsy if they kind of know the way things are going to go. Ryan, do you think about expectation setting much? Is it something you focus on?
So I'm mainly a convention GM at this point. Right. So a lot of my setting expectation, there's certainly like preamble so that people, there's a bunch of really tiny tricks that you do to get 4 or 5 or 6 people who don't know each other and you don't know them and they don't know you to within 10 minutes have enough of a rapport to not kill each other.
That's super interesting. Say more about that. Yeah.
Well, it's like so everyone is there. When you're at a convention game, everyone believes they're there for the same thing, and they're so not. But we use the same words to talk about we're here to have fun. It's like, well, first of all, that is you could have not used a more subjective word than fun. I mean, you can try, but you can't. So trying to my process or my objective of trying to set expectations be like it's actually about, it starts with setting human expectations. Like, hi, I'm Ryan, I'll be your GM, I'd like to get to know everybody real quick. And that alone just sets an expectation of you guys are all human beings. From there, a lot of the conversation that I can have about like, and this is the game, and this is the tone, does anybody have any questions or any thoughts? Like all those things, once I establish that we are all human beings and not weird avatars of somebody else's fun. Which is I used to fail a bunch, not realizing that was kind of how a lot of people saw the other people at the table when they didn't know them. It's a strange semi-dehumanizing factor. But that sense of setting expectation starts for me with setting like just the humanity of people, and then from there that gives me the opportunity to state what I believe is probably the game. And because it's a convention game, I am conveyed a little bit more authority over it, just by like the nature of sort of the space we're in, where everyone's like, well, the game, we're here because of this, so we presume that you're going to be kind of able to direct it some. You can like be able to like do something like facilitate fiasco. That's very different, although again, the be a human to each other is still a strong component to just setting that up. And for like, I'm running katanas and trench coats like twice this weekend. So part of the expectation, aside from after this getting into makeup, is to, which is by the way, prep, not planning. If you're going to make that distinction, to basically say, hey, this is, like, this game is sexy, which we all know is bullshit. So let me talk real quick about how sexy is just about lampooning stupid 90s stuff. Is everyone cool with that? Right? Like the words that you use, if you don't define them, will be defined in the minds of the people that you're talking with. And again, I'm a con GM. I have no idea how everyone is defining something. And I do absolutely know they are defining for themselves any words I say at least slightly differently.
Well, so I'm glad you bring up katanas and trench coats, because I don't like, let's say I'm a player and I don't know what katanas and trench coats is supposed to be about. Like, do you
okay, then you and I are on the same page. It's gonna be so okay, first of all, like if you don't, I'm actually like honestly like sort of I'm going to be intimidated because the game is so inside baseball that it's going to be kind of hard to explain, although I've been forced to explain it kind of enough. It's like, well, I then go immediately to media touchstones. Have you seen Supernatural?
Okay, yeah.
Yes. Do you like it? No. You may not want to be here. And that is legit. I will help you find another game, because being at least briefly magnanimous is far better than just casting someone aside.
Media touchdowns is it's super smart. I find that I like to have that ready to go. Like especially if I don't like, I rarely play in circumstances where I just absolutely don't know the people I'm playing with. I mean, every now and then I get somebody who is brand new to the Gauntlet and I've never played with them, but I do like to have like something ready to go that's easily understandable, so I can say, this is just like the X-Files or this, like have that kind of stuff ready to go in case those questions inevitably kind of come up. A couple of questions that are coming in on the Discord are pretty interesting, and it kind of goes back to the first part. So we're kind of backing up a little bit, but I want to get them in there. Basically, it's about tropes, and that kind of piggybacks off what I just said. How do you get, like, to the extent that you use media touchstones and tropes in how you are kind of like presenting a game or even like running the game, Phil? Like, how do you make sure that you avoid like cliches or stereotypes? Like, what kinds of things do you look out for?
So I think that first of all, it depends on the game, right? Like if you're playing, like, so again, I'm just going to, because I always, my examples will always be what I'm currently running. So, so I'm running, I'm running Blades. And so, procedural crime stuff is huge for, for tropes that I can draw from gangster movies, things like that. And so the trick is to make sure that what you take out as a trope, because tropes are great. Tropes are great. They're nice little shortcuts. And when you need to kind of get, convey things to people quickly, having some of these tropes are these like really nice little touchstones for people to grasp onto, but they need to not jar with your setting. So when you kind of take out a trope and you put it into Blades, you need to remember that it's that kind of creepy Victorian, Duskfall thing. So, you got to make sure you just kind of sync those up. But now like if I'm playing something like Action Movie World, I will be as cliche as possible. Like,
right. Yeah. That's the point.
That game just encourages it. Like I don't even try to cover those up. And in fact, the players love it even more when they can immediately identify, a particular, cliche or trope in the game. So I think tropes are great. And I actually use TV tropes quite a bit. Like I will actually go in and read up, like especially if I'm playing a different genre. I mean, I will set a timer.
Yeah. Because wow, that's I've learned something.
Yeah, you need somebody to pull you out of TV tropes once you go into it. So, whether it's a buddy system or a timer or something to get you back out of it. But like it's really good, especially if it's a genre you're not super familiar with, going into TV tropes and kind of reading up on them, and then you'll instantly recognize them as soon as you start reading them. You'll be like, oh yeah, of course, that thing, yeah. And then again, kind of paint them over, like pick them up, but paint them over with your setting, like so that they don't feel jarring.
Yeah, awesome. Let's go on to in the middle of play. I'm particularly interested in talking about spotlight management. I think spotlight management is, like I said in our notes, I think like the difference between a great GM and a really, really awesome GM is how they manage spotlight at the table.
Can I point out a thing?
Sure, please.
Just reveal that there are notes, which means that you have, in fact, planned and prepped for this show.
Yes,
that's shining some spotlight on you.
Let's talk about spotlight. I mean, am I wrong here? Like, is it important? Like, Ryan, what do you think? Like, how important is spotlight?
Oh no, the spotlight is completely frivolous. No, of course, it's definitely important. But it can be important for like a bunch of different reasons. If nothing else, we're all here to have fun, then ideally you want everyone to participate in their fun, if not at the level that they want to, at least at a level that's not detrimental to other people, which is, I used to say, at equal level, but it turns out that that's not true, because there are people who are comfortable with less spotlight. There are people who are comfortable with as much spotlight as they can take, in which case that's where actual management comes in. But the big thing for me is the movement of spotlight. we if you watch any movie or anything, and we all speak the language of media when we play in some form or another, whether directly or indirectly, then you watch that the spotlight moves, and that's where interesting stuff, that's where action happens. I mean, spotlight is moving right now. I mean, maybe not because I'm still talking, but as soon as I'm done talking or someone interrupts, it will move because that's what we're all interested in. So if spotlight metaphorically moves, then when I'm able to, I physically move with it.
Oh, interesting.
I get up from the table when it's possible. And I actually will change my position to help illustrate that spotlight is itself moving.
That's really interesting. I've definitely never done that. But I also mostly play online, so that's a big part of that, I guess. But yeah, that's super interesting. I think for me, I would probably feel like really like, oh man, they're all looking at me now because I'm getting up at the table. Right? Like,
if you do that enough over a course of time,
it probably becomes like a second nature thing. It makes a lot of sense in the con context too, I guess. You know,
yeah, that's the thing is like like again, these are at a con. This is my way of like cool. If there are two people talking but they're both looking at me, and this was when I figured out that this was a thing.
Have you ever climbed on a table?
Not yet, but squad goals.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, it's like it's just whatever you can do to keep the spotlight moving, and then watching people who become uncomfortable with it.
That's really good. Yeah, that's good. I was going to say. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Just that's because we're all told, hey, distribute the spotlight, share the spotlight. We rarely say, and watch for people who want to get out of it.
That's a great point. I remember when when I used to run games back in Houston. I was kind of first getting back into like role-playing games and GMing games, and so there's a lot of things I was really sensitive to, right? And I was really sensitive to like players at the table. Like, oh, are they getting enough time? Like, oh, does that person, like, I feel like I'm spending too much time over here. I feel bad for that person. But what I began to realize is you're right. Everyone wants more or less, right? And they're having just as much fun. And I would talk to that player. They'd be like, no, like, I'm great. Like, this is perfect for me. Like, I'm just having fun here, you know. You begin to figure that out. Now, in a con situation, it seems like that'd be really hard to do, actually. But in a long-term game or in a regular group, you do start to like figure out like, oh, I know that player X, I know I can kind of let them like sit tight for a little bit and they're cool, right? Whereas player Y, they want to be like on stage like all the time. Phil, what do you think about spotlight management?
So yeah, I think everything you guys said is really good and really true. And the way I usually figure out, even in a con situation, whether a person wants a lot of spotlight is if you just make sure that you're going around the table asking what people are doing. The people who aren't really into spotlight will answer kind of very quickly. They'll say something very supportive, like, "Oh, I'm with so-and-so, like I'm backing them up."
Yeah, that
like,
makes sense.
They won't put themselves out forward. They'll kind of pull themselves back. So what I try to do is I always make sure that I basically, metaphorically touch every player. Like as we're going around in the scene, I'll make sure that I'll just say, okay, so, so-and-so's negotiating. What are you doing? And they say like, oh, I'm just, I'm going to sit by them and listen to make sure the negotiations go well. Perfect. Okay. Next, on to the next person.
Yeah.
But if somebody's like, if I go to them and I say, what are you doing? They're like, well, I'm going to go look for somebody I can talk to. What they're saying to me is like, well, I'm ready for a little more spotlight. Can you provide something? And I'll, then I'll kind of go into a little bit more of a scene. And I try to, especially like for PBTA games, my rule is like 1 to 2 moves, and then I need to go check on everybody else. So I don't mind if I've sliced up the table into 3 scenes and I'm bouncing between them, but about every 1 to 2 moves, I need to move the spotlight to the, back over to somebody else. And I will also cue people up because I'll say to them, okay, I'm going to, let's do this, let's play out that move. Okay. And then Jason, I'm gonna come back to you. And then I'm going to go over to Ryan. And then, just kind of give people that expectation and then jump back in.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. In a PBTA game, especially, I like to. This is something that Kate and I talk about a lot. Kate Bullock, one of my co-hosts on one of the shows, we talk about like when to cut, right? Like when is a good time to cut. And in a PBTA game, especially, like a great opportunity to cut is like on a missed roll. like as soon as the mist roll happens, like leave them on the edge of their seat, like come back to them, that kind of thing. I like to cut right before. Sometimes I like to do a cut or take a break, like right before like a particularly intense conversation, to give the players like a chance to think about how that's going to go or whatever. But yeah, you're right. Like cutting and moving around the table, I think is really super effective. Great thing to do. Kate also was in the Discord, and she asked the following, which I thought was pretty interesting. What does wanting to get out of the spotlight look like? Like, what are the tells? How do you know, Ryan, when someone's like uncomfortable with spotlight?
All right, so this is all in the like having to cold read a table that you just met
Right.
like maybe half an hour ago. All right, so as a GM, I need to pay attention to eye movement. When I'm seeing eyes darting around, usually away, it's like, okay, I need to find out, like, I need to evaluate what's wrong, if it's in the table, if it's out of the table, are they talking and they're darting around? Are they not talking and darting around? Are they like suddenly, because that's a symbol of discomfort in some form or another. Watching if people begin to sound like they are tired vocally. If they are, whether that's in shorter sentences. So you like, one of the things about getting to know people as humans is that in that sort of first preamble, you get to figure out how long people will talk. So trying to figure out the shorter sentence people, if that changes over time, it's like there's like, I feel like that's its own, like at one point I was going to write a book about this, and then it got weird, like as far as like I went way too sort of deep into like pop pseudo psychology. So I'm like, okay, I actually don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but I know enough about table reading to be able to say, like, these are the kind of things that I look for that tell me that someone wants to somehow disengage in the game, which is different from people who want to engage but don't know how, which is another question. That's it's a more specific question on the Discord about people with social anxiety or autism who want to get more spotlight in, wherein I watch for particular forms of fidgeting, sort of stammering, along with eye movement. It's very easy to then also watch mouths that feel like they're about to say something and not. And my ways of dealing with that particular side of it too, which is also a litmus test for figuring out if someone is sort of wallflowering and enjoying it, wallflowering and not enjoying it, or having an anxiety thing where they actually want to disengage somehow, is to ask other people questions in the scene that they're not in.
Oh, interesting.
My favorite horror trick, incidentally, is to be like, and then there's a hand reaching for you, and I'll turn to someone else and say, "What color is it?" It's like, "It's purple." Oh my, it's totally purple and like all shimmery and stuff, right? They're like, yeah, great. You should hate that person now. It's totally purple and shimmery. One that gets them kind of engaged in the scene, and like, while they don't have spotlight, they have engagement. And I can use how excited they are, how interested they are, how surprised or maybe feeling like on the spot they are, to figure out if I should do that again, if I should cue them up, if I should find out a different way to engage them.
That's fabulous. One of the things that I do in my games a lot, and I've talked about it on our shows before, is, and this is not necessarily to do with managing people with social anxiety. It's just a sort of best practice thing for me. But basically, if I know someone is about to be the focus of a scene, it's going to take up a good 5-10 minutes or whatever, I will usually ask the other players at the table to help like fill in the cool details in that scene, kind of like you just said, like what color is their hand, right? My favorite thing to do is like, okay, we're in your character's house for the first time. We're going to see your character doing some stuff. That's great. Everybody else, like, what do you see? How do you know what you're like? What do you see right now that lets you know that this person has dealt with, is currently dealing with the loss of their child, right? What do you see in the house? What do you see that lets you know that that this place used to be a place of joy, right? Or even just something simple, like, like what does it look like?
Right.
But yeah, so super interesting.
Name one thing, which can be a really, just nice. It's not a lot of pressure. Like those questions, as long as they don't create a bunch of pressure,
right? You
can then judge, or if they're not framed to create a bunch of pressure, you can judge the people for whom that is still pressure.
Yeah, and it's a spotlight management thing too, right? Because like, if I know I'm going to be with someone for a while, or it's a scene that's just about one character, we're still letting the other players like do something, right? Like they're not just sitting there being bored. So, Phil, anything else you want to say about spotlight management before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to the thing about the question about social anxieties, I think that one of the things, especially, and it happens in con games, and it especially happens if you don't know people really well, is sometimes putting a little pressure on by, bearing down on them with the scene. Like, okay, it's all right, Jason, okay, so this is what's happening. Tell me what you do. And just easing that up a little, because sometimes people just need like a few more seconds to think.
Mm-hmm.
And they're composing themselves. And so the technique you said about going to ask other people questions is, as long as I make sure they know, like, hey, take a few seconds to kind of think that through. I'm going to go over, like, I'm coming right back to you, or as soon as you're ready, just look at me and I will, shift right back to you. But I'll do this little thing right here on the side. So I think that's really helpful. It's really about making people the worst thing you do is then just put more pressure on them, like, come up with something. So sometimes I even just offer, like, I'll say, like, well, I don't know, does your broker, like, is he really like overbearing, or is he kind, like, is she kind of smooth talking? I'll just throw a few options out, not to lead the player, but just sometimes if you give them something to look at, they'll either like it, or then they'll completely pick the opposite. Like, oh, no, they're not smooth at all. Like, they're really loud and boisterous. Oh, great. Tell me more about that. And, kind of just draw
you
them
bringing
in.
up the one thing got them to think about the other thing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah,
Sometimes you got to, like, sometimes people need like a little jump start.
Yeah. That makes sense.
You mind if I go the other way on that?
Sure.
About the sort of the smooth in of, like, because sometimes you tell people, like, hey, do you need a moment? Sometimes weird social pressures, again, at con games, they want to say no because people are trying to, like, perform at a level of other people. Like, there's a bunch of, like, stuff at con games. So my way of asking that without asking that is just like, it's a body language, so to go in. It's like, so you're, like, being shot at. How do you feel? Like, would you like to avoid that? I mean, you don't have to. It's what do you do? And then there's, like, sort of a laughter or a smile or something, which is itself a second or two. And all of these little, like, bits of time then lead into, like, I feel like dodging. I mean, that's a simple one of just, like, it's combat, whatever. My options are dodge or not dodge. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, of course you're going to do the thing. But, like, you use that in a sense of even, like, a complex thing. And you can use that to create space without putting pressure obligation on someone. And then when you kind of figure out after a while they're cool, that they have no problem answering, yeah, I need a moment, then, like, sweet, I'm just going to ask you that because it's so much easier for me to do that than to try to manage a bunch of 6 people's emotions at a table. 7 if I count me.
Really good to keep in mind. That's super good to keep in mind. I like I said earlier, I don't run games in the convention environment, and the games I run for people on Gauntlet Hangouts, which is many, it's still mostly with people who I play with a lot, right? Like because they sign up quickly whenever my games go up, and so I always kind of play with a lot of the same people, and so I'm really used to just, like, throwing spotlight or asking questions, leading questions, this, that, like, at those people, like, pretty, like, fast, and so. It's good to keep in mind, because I think if I were in a con environment, I would probably also try to play that way. And so I may be putting, like, undue pressure on people. So nice to be reminded of. Awesome. Well, let's take a look at the Discord, see if there's anything else before we go on to the next section. Looks like we're all pretty good there.
It is worth definitely mentioning for those who aren't on Discord, the take a short bio break is such a great trick for
my god,
yes, things.
Yeah, we talk about that on our podcast all the time, and Kate gives me a hard time because she doesn't do breaks at all, and or she rarely does. No, the bio break is, like, genius. Like, the bio break is, like, the way you solve problems, right? Like, it is my number one tip. If you can't think of what's about to happen, take a bio break. If the table clearly, like, has some, like, there's a lot of, like, churn going on in their minds and trying to figure things out, take a bio break. Like, a bio break will save your bacon, like, in a big way. And good stuff. So glad you bring that up. Great point. Awesome. Well, let's just kind of go to our last section here then. I'm feeling pretty good about this. So let's talk about post-session. I think this is really interesting because I actually personally don't have any post-session rituals or procedures. I hate roses and thorns. It's just a personal thing for me. I know a lot of people love it and they do it, and that's great. Phil, what kind of post-session stuff do you do?
So I don't think I do anything terribly formal. So, but I do like to find out if, and again, completely subjective, and I'm okay with it at the end of a game, but, did you have a good time? Like, we don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily need to be fun or a particular emotion, but did you enjoy like your time at the table? Like that's to me that's important, because I kind of want to get a feel, like, one, did I read everybody correctly? Because I can usually tell if somebody didn't have a good time. I can read that. And two, if they did, then I kind of, want to hear some things about what they liked. But then I always like to try to, I always like to try to remember one cool thing that each player did and just tell them that. Like, I loved your scene with, so-and-so, or I loved your plan. Like, it was really good. Because I'm also being entertained by the play of the game. And so, my part of that is to then tell everyone else, like, these are the things you did that I like totally loved. And so, thanks, because you entertained me as much as I hope that I entertained you guys.
Awesome. Ryan, you do any post-session stuff?
Again, this is like from the con GM standpoint, but the thing that I consider a sin is to actually, in that moment, ask if they had a good time. Because the social conventions of 6 people, and I really hope I never have to run for 6 again, but I use that as like, back when I was a GERT GM, that's what you had to do in order to get a really crappy bit of hotel space at Gen Con. Was to say, if you ask that, people say yes, even if they don't mean it. So instead, and then that creates weird, awkward social obligation, and I don't want to have to deal with that personally, let alone in a sort of pseudo professional setting. So one, if there's an XP system at all, even if it doesn't matter, I talk about it, because even if it doesn't matter, it's a good way to close out thinking about the game.
That's really good. Yeah,
like, Ryan. I like what you said, Ryan. Like, I also do this. Like, I don't call anyone out. Like, I won't point at anyone and be like, "Did you have a good time?" It's more like, "Hey, I hope everyone had a good time."
And that's how I was about to say. Is I express hope, but I'm like super like, thank you guys so much for coming. This was a real blast. I hope you had a good time too. And like, I'll like, be like, I might be like, yeah, I'll be hanging out for like the next like 15 minutes before I'm doing a thing. If you guys want to grab coffee, or like, hey, I'll see you around the con, and feel free to say hi. Like, if I start with the human connection, I end with the human connection.
That's really good. For me, running on Gauntlet Hangouts, we do debriefs after the game. We go into our Gauntlet Discord channel, and we just do like a little audio debrief. That's what I do anyway. A lot of the GMs will do roses and thorns, which is like, tell me a rose, tell me a thorn, tell me a good thing, tell me a bad thing. I don't like that, because like you said, Ryan, I feel like there's sometimes undue pressure to do either a rose or thorn, even if you don't have anything to say, and the thorns part of it to me just always feels like a death march. Like, I always just feel like, oh my God, like, here come the thorns, and so I'm like much more about like, I want to keep it super positive. I love positive reinforcement. I want to tell everybody what I thought they did great. And mind you, these are people I play with a lot, right? Sure. I want to tell them when I thought they did great. I want to tell them, like, I loved when you did this. I loved when you did that. And then they'll give me that too. And then if there's something we need to talk about, it comes up, right? Like, once you kind of get that like positive, happy, feel good stuff going, the sort of like, well, I kind of wish this had gone this way sort of stuff will happen, right? So, yeah. Sorry, you can say something.
I do sort of the roses and thorns thing in play testing, because I'm trying to get particular bits of
that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
But outside of it, that whole thing of like, hey, come and, if you see me again, say hi. I use that opportunity, like, hey, so is there anything that like I could have done better? Like, at that moment, it's partly a human it's partly a human connection thing, and it's partly a status reset thing. Because at a convention CM, I can have like a weird high status that I don't want. So if I immediately set myself to be like, no, we're human, and I could have like, and I would like your input, people are a bit more. It's easier to talk to people that way. Yeah, it's easier to get honest feedback that way.
I mean, I think you're right. Like, playtest is clinical. Like, playtest could be, it could be all thorns. I will.
Right.
I demand. Well, I mean, demand's a hard word, but I do push people to give me the positives, and I always say, tell me what to not change.
Right.
Because if all you tell me is the negatives, I will burn this entire thing down and change the like. So tell me what to not change.
I have a support system that keeps me from deleting all my files during draft times. Yeah.
Awesome.
Oh, I have self-loathing to keep me from deleting my drafts.
Well, so we're right at the time when we said we wanted to quit because we all have to run off to games, but and there's about 100 other things I want to talk about. So I feel like we could have gone all night, but any other just like little quick closing thoughts from you guys? Like anything you want to say about like just sort of cosmic things about being a great GM?
Don't put undue pressure on yourself.
Yeah, I agree.
Like some days it's good, some days it's bad. I mean, I've been a GM for I don't know, like 35 years. I still have a bad session from time to time. It happens.
Yeah.
And then when you do, just walk it off. It's fine. The next one will be okay.
Yeah, agreed. I always tell people like I feel like when you sit down to like run a game, I feel like I always start with everybody there is on my side, right? Like I think everybody there wants me to do well because they all came to have an experience, right? And so for me, that helps me. Like it helps me to know that like unless it's just super obvious they're not on my side, like for the most part, it feels good. Like for me, it's soothing to know that like, hey, they want you to do really well. And what that usually translates to is they'll forget all the little things that you're consumed with that you think were awful. They did not notice, or they're not going to notice, right? So just my perspective, I guess. Ryan, any closing thoughts before we go?
When I mentioned this whole like 10 years of patterns thing, I can reframe it to 10 years of failure. And I'm not necessarily saying that other people should spend 10 years failing. I hope that you get it sooner than I did. Be fantastic. But like, just be unafraid but humble about failure. It's going to happen. You're going to learn from it. You're gonna be kind of going ever forward, right? Like and from that, if you can figure out, like, if you can really think about the ways you fail without being like horribly like self-deprecating about it, then you'll ingrain so many things that make your GMing better and faster and easier.
Perfect way to end it. Well, thanks guys so much for doing this panel with me. We will put all the different social media links for you guys in the description of the video. But thanks again. It was great.
Yeah, thanks for having.
All right. Well, that's our panel. Thanks everyone for watching.